Sections. The sun came up cold over the Montana grasslands, spilling pale light across a world that had forgotten the meaning of warmth. Thomas Whitaker stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the horizon bleed from black to gray, to that thin, watery blue that promised nothing. The coffee in his tin cup had gone cold an hour ago. He'd stopped noticing. His mornings had been the same for 3 years now. Rise before dawn, stand on the porch, stare at land that stretched farther than a man could ride in a day, and feel nothing but the weight of all that emptiness pressing against his chest. He was 38 years old and looked 50. The sun had carved lines into his face that made him look like the land itself. Weathered, hard, and unforgiving. His hands were scarred from barbed wire and leather, his back stiff from sleeping on a thin mattress in a room he'd stopped trying to make comfortable. The cabin behind him was functional, clean, cold, every tool in its place, every surface scrubbed, every corner swept. It was a house that had forgotten how to be a home. But his wife had died in the winter of 1883. Pneumonia. The cough had started in November, and by February she was gone. He'd buried her on the hill behind the cabin where the wildflowers grew in spring, though he never went up there to see them. Their daughter had followed her mother 6 weeks later. Same cough. Same cold ground. He'd carved both their names into a single wooden cross, and then he'd stopped speaking unless he had to. There was no one left to talk to anyway. Sections. He drained the cold coffee, tasting nothing, and walked down the porch steps. And his dog, a German shepherd named Clay, rose from his spot by the door and followed without being called. The animal had been a pup when his daughter was alive. Now it was 7 years old and moved with the same quiet efficiency as its master. No wasted motion, no unnecessary sound. They understood each other. They were both survivors of the same wreck. Sections. Thomas walked the fence line every morning. 40 acres of grazing land, another 20 of scrub and rock that wasn't good for much except keeping the wind from taking everything else. He checked each post, each wire, each gate. The work was automatic. His hands knew what to do, without his mind having to direct them. Clay ranged ahead, nose to the ground, tracking rabbits he'd never catch and didn't really want to. 4. By the time Thomas returned to the cabin, the sun was high and hot, and the morning cold burned away. He unsaddled his horse, a bay gelding named Rust, and turned him loose in the corral. The animal went straight to the water trough and drank deep. Thomas watched him for a moment, and then turned toward the cabin. He'd heat beans for lunch. Same as yesterday. Same as tomorrow. Piper. That's when he heard Clay barking. Piper. The dog never barked. Not at coyotes, not at strangers, not at anything. Thomas turned fast, his hand going instinctively to the rifle he'd left, leaning against the porch rail. Clay was 50 yards out, standing rigid at the edge of the tree line that marked the creek. His bark was sharp and insistent, not aggressive, but urgent. Something was wrong. Pargafper. Thomas grabbed the rifle and walked toward the sound. His boots crunched on dry grass. The air smelled like dust and pine sap. Clay was still barking, but now he was looking back at Thomas, then at the trees, then back again. Hurry. Come see. This matters. Palmer. Thomas reached the tree line and saw her. She was lying in the shallow water of the creek, half submerged, her body twisted at an angle that made his stomach clench. For one terrible second he thought she was dead. Then she moved. Just a slight shift of her head, but it was enough. She was breathing. He splashed into the creek without thinking, the cold water soaking through his boots. He got his hands under her shoulders, and pulled her up onto the bank. She was small, light, her body burning with fever even through the wet fabric of her dress. Her skin was brown, her hair black and tangled with leaves and mud. She was native. He could see that in the shape of her face, the set of her features, and her dress was torn, her feet bare and bloody. She'd been running. Ripeti, her eyes opened for just a second, dark, unfocused, seeing nothing. Then they closed again. Thomas looked around. No one, no sounds of pursuit, no horses, no voices. Just the creek and the trees and the woman in his arms who was dying if he didn't move fast. Purr. He carried her back to the cabin. She weighed almost nothing. Clay ran ahead, then circled back, then ran ahead again, agitated in a way Thomas had never seen. The dog knew this was important. Sections inside, Thomas laid her on his bed, the only bed in the cabin. He stripped off her wet dress without looking at her body, covering her immediately with every blanket he owned. Her skin was fire-hot. The fever was deep, dangerous. He'd seen this before. He knew how it ended if you didn't fight it, in sections. He built up the fire until the cabin was sweltering. He boiled water and soaked rags, pressing them to her forehead, her neck, her wrists. He forced water between her cracked lips, a few drops at a time, waiting for her to swallow before giving her more. She didn't wake, didn't speak, didn't open her eyes. For 3 days she burned. Thomas didn't leave the cabin except to get water from the well. He slept in the chair by the fire, waking every hour to check her breathing, to give her water, to change the rags. Clay lay by the bed, his head on his paws, watching her with worried eyes. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Up here. Thomas woke in the chair to find her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. He stood slowly, his back screaming from too many nights in the chair, and walked to the bed. Her eyes tracked him, but her expression didn't change. She looked at him the way a wild animal looks at a trap, calculating distance, assessing threat, deciding whether to fight or freeze, Marvin's. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out to her. She didn't reach for it. He set it on the crate beside the bed and stepped back. 3 steps. 4, giving her space. She watched him the whole time. Bye, Pearl. Then slowly, she sat up. The blankets fell away. She was wearing one of his old shirts. He'd put it on her after the fever broke, and her dress had dried stiff with creek mud. She looked at the shirt, then at him. He saw the question in her eyes, but she didn't ask it. She reached for the cup and drank. Her hands shook. Thomas waited until she finished, then gestured to the door. She stiffened, and he shook his head and pointed to himself, then to the door, then made a walking motion with his fingers. I'm leaving. You can stay. She watched him, unmoving. He turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. He sat on the porch for an hour. When he went back inside, she was standing by the window, still wearing his shirt, staring out at the grasslands. She turned when he entered, but didn't move away from the window. He went to the stove and heated beans and cornbread. He put half on a plate and set it on the table, then took his own plate outside. He ate on the porch, listening to the silence from inside the cabin. Bite her. When he went back in, the plate was empty. She stayed. He didn't ask her to, and he didn't ask her to leave. She simply stayed. She slept in the bed, and he slept in the chair. In the morning, he found her standing by the door, waiting. He opened it, and she walked out, Clay at her heels. She went to the creek and washed. She came back and stood by the cabin, looking at the land, the sky, the mountains in the distance. She was reading the world the way he read fence lines, checking for breaks, for weaknesses, for danger. Sections, he left food for her on the table. She ate when he wasn't in the room. He left a pair of his old boots by the door. They were too big, but she wore them anyway, stuffing the toes with rags. He left a needle and thread on the table. She mended her dress and hung it to air outside. She never said a word. Parbour, a week passed, then two. Thomas fell into a new routine. He still rose before dawn, still walked the fence line, still worked from sunup to sundown. But now, there were small changes. Then his plate was washed when he came in from the fields. The floor was swept. The blankets on the bed were folded with corners so crisp they could cut. She was working, contributing, refusing to be useless. Sections. He started leaving tools for her. A spade by the back wall, a hoe, a bucket. She took them without acknowledgement and disappeared for hours. He found her one afternoon on the south side of the cabin, digging. She'd cleared a plot of earth 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, turned the soil, pulled the rocks. She was building a garden in ground that hadn't grown anything but weeds in 3 years. He watched her work. She moved with absolute focus, her body bent to the task, her hands dark with soil. She didn't notice him watching, or if she did, she didn't care. And he walked back to the barn and found a sack of seeds he'd bought 2 years ago and never planted. Beans, squash, corn. He left the sack by the garden plot and walked away. Parbour. The next morning, the seeds were in the ground, the Parbour. Thomas went into town once a month for supplies. He dreaded it. The town of Stillwater was 15 miles south, a collection of wooden buildings and hard-eyed people who'd decided long ago that Thomas Whitaker was a strange, silent man best left alone. He bought flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition. He spoke to no one. No one spoke to him. Parfour. But this time was different. Parfour. He was loading supplies into the wagon when he heard the voice behind him. "Heard you got yourself some company, Whitaker." Thomas turned. Ezra Cobb stood there, arms crossed, a mean smile on his fat face. Ezra owned half the land around Stillwater and thought that made him important. He had 3 sons, all of them as cruel and stupid as their father. 2 of them were standing behind him now, grinning. Parbour. Thomas said nothing. Parbour. "Word is you got a squaw living up at your place," Ezra continued. "That true?" Parbour. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. He turned back to the wagon and kept loading. "Vati asked you a question, Whitaker." Parbour. Thomas tied down the last crate and climbed onto the wagon seat. He picked up the reins. "You think you're better than us?" Ezra's voice was louder now, drawing attention. People were stopping to watch. "Think you can just take one of them savages into your house and nobody's gonna say nothing?" Thomas looked at him. Just looked. His eyes were flat, cold, empty of everything except a warning. Ezra saw it and took a step back. His sons didn't move. They weren't smart enough to read the danger. Sections Thomas drove out of town. Behind him, he heard Ezra's voice, loud and mocking. "She even speak English, Whitaker? Or are you just keeping her around for the Parbour?" Thomas didn't hear the rest. He was already gone. For when he got back to the cabin, she was in the garden, on her knees, pulling weeds. Clay was lying in the shade nearby, watching her. Thomas unhitched the wagon and carried the supplies inside. He put everything away in silence. Then he walked out to the garden and stood there, watching her work. She glanced up at him, then back down at the soil. Parbour. He wanted to tell her, wanted to warn her that the town knew she was here, that there might be trouble. But he didn't have the words. He didn't know how to say it in a way she'd understand. So he just stood there, useless, until she looked up again. This time, she held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, just once, and went back to work. Parfour, she knew. Somehow she knew. Parfour. The garden grew. Thomas watched it happen with something close to wonder. The beans climbed the stakes she'd built from willow branches. The squash spread across the ground in thick green vines. The corn stood in straight rows, taller every day. She watered it every morning and evening, carrying buckets from the creek. She pulled weeds with her bare hands. She sang while she worked. Soft, wordless sounds that weren't quite a melody, but weren't quite not a melody either. It was the first sound he'd heard her make besides breathing. He started working closer to the cabin, on fixing the porch rail that had been loose for a year, replacing shingles on the roof, splitting firewood even though it was summer and they didn't need it yet. He told himself it was just work that needed doing, but the truth was, he wanted to be near enough to hear her singing. Part chapter. One evening, he came in from the fields to find the cabin filled with a smell he didn't recognize. She was at the stove, stirring something in the pot. She glanced at him, then back at the pot. He washed his hands at the basin and sat at the table. She ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of him. Then she filled her own bowl and sat across from him. Parfour. He looked down at the stew. It was full of things he recognized: beans, squash, wild onions from the creek, and things he didn't. Herbs, roots, things she'd foraged from the land around the cabin. He took a bite. The flavor exploded in his mouth, rich, complex, nothing like the bland beans and salt pork he'd been eating for 3 years. He looked up at her. She was watching him, waiting. Parfour. He nodded. She looked away, but not before he saw the corner of her mouth lift. Just barely. Just enough. Parfour. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, not empty. Full. Parfour. The next morning he found a bundle of wildflowers in a tin cup on the table, yellow and purple and white, tied with a piece of grass. He stared at them for a long time. They were the first beautiful thing that had been in this cabin since his wife died. He left them where they were. But that night after dinner, he did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He took his guitar down from the wall. The strings were dusty, some of them slack. He tuned it slowly, the sounds awkward and harsh at first, then settling into something close to right. She watched him from across the room, her hands still on the mending in her lap. He played. His fingers were stiff, clumsy, but the melody came back. It was a song his mother had taught him, slow and sad and sweet. He played it all the way through, then set the guitar aside. When he looked up, she was staring at him. Her eyes were wet. Or she stood and walked to the door. She opened it and went outside. He thought maybe he'd done something wrong, scared her somehow. But then he heard it, her voice, rising in the darkness. She was singing, really singing. Not the wordless humming from the garden, but a full song in a language he didn't understand. The melody was haunting, beautiful, nothing like anything he'd ever heard, and it rose and fell like wind over grass, like water over stones. Sections. He stood in the doorway and listened until she finished. Then she came back inside, walked past him without looking at him, and went to bed. He lay in the chair that night and thought about the sound of her voice. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Summer deepened. The garden exploded with life. She harvested beans and squash and corn, laying them out to dry on racks she'd built from branches. She dug roots and stripped bark and collected seeds. She was preparing for winter the way his wife used to, the way he'd stopped doing after she died. The cabin began to fill with stores, jars of preserved vegetables, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, sacks of cornmeal and dried beans. The house was coming back to life. Sections. Thomas found himself talking to her, not expecting answers, just talking. He'd point to a tool and say its name. Hammer. She'd watch him, silent. He'd point to the horse. Rust. She'd nod. He'd point to the dog. Clay. The dog's ears would perk up, and she'd smile, just a little, just enough to crack the careful blankness of her face. Sections. One evening he pointed to himself. Thomas. Then he pointed to her and waited. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked away. He didn't push. He just nodded and went back to his work. Pechaferor. 3 months. She'd been with him for 3 months, and she hadn't spoken a single word. He'd stopped expecting her to. The silence between them had become its own kind of language. He knew what it meant when she stood by the window in the morning. She was reading the weather. He knew what it meant when Clay followed her to the creek. She was going to wash and wanted the dog's company, not his. He knew what it meant when she left food on his plate, even after he'd said he was full. Eat it anyway. You're too thin. Paragraph 4. He knew her. And somehow, impossibly, she knew him. Paragraph. Then Ezra Cobb came to the ranch. Paragraph. It was late afternoon. Thomas was in the barn, mending tack. Clay started barking, the same urgent bark from the day Thomas had found her at the creek. Thomas dropped the leather and walked outside. 3 horses were coming up the road, Ezra and his 2 sons. Proper Thomas walked to the porch. She was standing in the doorway, half hidden in shadow. He could feel her tension from 10 feet away. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and waited. Forrider Ezra reined in his horse and sat there, looking down at Thomas with that same mean smile. Whitaker. Thought I'd ride out and have a talk with you. PR4. Thomas said nothing. PR4. See, there's been some talk in town about you and that squaw you got living here. Some folks think it ain't right. Some folks think maybe she ought to be moved along. Sent back to the reservation where she belongs. Pietro. Thomas felt his hands curl into fists. He forced them open. Now, I'm a reasonable man, Ezra continued. I understand a man gets lonely. But there's ways to handle that don't involve bringing savages into a Christian community. You understand what I'm saying? Paragraph 4. Thomas understood. He understood that Ezra Cobb was a bully and a coward, and the kind of man who hurt people because he could. He understood that the town had sent him out here to deliver a message. But he understood that this was going to end badly. She leaves by the end of the week, Ezra said, or we'll come back and move her ourselves. You hear me, Whitaker? Page Rapper. Thomas heard him. He also heard the creak of the porch boards behind him. She'd stepped out of the doorway. She was standing at the top of the steps now, visible. Ezra's eyes went to her, and his smile widened. Well now, he said. There she is. You're a pretty little thing, ain't you? Shame you're wasted on a broken-down hermit like Whitaker here. Sections. Thomas took a step forward. Ezra's sons moved their hands to their guns. Thomas stopped. 3 against 1. Bad odds. He'd lose. And then there'd be no one to protect her. Par 4. Ezra laughed. That's what I thought. End of the week, Whitaker. Don't make us come back. 4. He turned his horse and rode away, and his sons following. Thomas stood there, watching them go, his heart hammering in his chest. When they were out of sight, he turned and looked up at her. She was staring at the road, her face unreadable. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were dark, steady, unafraid. But she walked down the steps, past him, and went to the garden. She picked up the hoe and went back to work as if nothing had happened. And Thomas stood there, useless, his hands shaking with rage he couldn't release. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the fire, the rifle across his knees, staring at nothing, while she was in the bed, breathing soft and steady. Clay was on the floor between them, his head up, ears forward. The dog knew something was wrong. Thomas thought about his options. That he could take her to the reservation. There was one about 50 miles north. But he didn't know if she'd come from there. Didn't know if she'd be safe there. Didn't know if she'd want to go. He could fight. 3 men with guns. He'd die. She'd be taken anyway. He could run, load the wagon, take her south or west, start over somewhere else. But Ezra would follow. Men like Ezra always followed. Paro. There was no good choice. Every path led to loss. He was still sitting there when the sun came up. She rose from the bed and walked to the window. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the land. Then she turned and looked at him. She walked across the room and stood in front of him. She reached out and touched his face, just her fingertips against his cheek, so light he barely felt it. Then she walked outside. Pargafor. He sat there, frozen, his skin burning where she'd touched him. Watched the week past like a storm rolling in, slow, inevitable, heavy with the promise of violence. Thomas worked, she worked, they ate together in silence. But now the silence was different. It was waiting, listening, braced for impact. Pavor. On the 7th day, Thomas woke to find her standing by the table, dressed in her mended dress, her hair braided, her feet in the 2 big boots. She'd packed a small bundle, her few belongings wrapped in a piece of cloth. She was leaving. He stood up fast, the chair scraping against the floor. She looked at him. Her face was calm, but her eyes were bright with something he couldn't name. She picked up the bundle and walked to the door. Bar. He moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 strides. He put his hand on the door, holding it closed. But she stopped. They stood there, inches apart, not touching. He could feel the heat of her body, smell the sage and wood smoke scent of her hair. No, he said. His voice was rough from disuse, the word cracked and harsh. No. She looked up at him, waiting. You stay, he said. They want you gone. They'll have to go through me. Pervar. She stared at him. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something. Truth, maybe. Conviction. The willingness to die for a stranger. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found it, because she nodded. Once. Then she set the bundle down and walked back to the table. Parabra. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Parabra. They came at noon. Thomas saw the dust from a mile away. Not 3 riders this time. 6. Ezra had brought reinforcements. Thomas checked his rifle. He made sure it was loaded and walked out onto the porch. She followed him. He turned to tell her to stay inside, but she shook her head. She stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. Clay stood on his other side, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Prr. The riders came up the road and stopped 20 feet from the porch. Ezra was in the center, flanked by his sons and 3 other men Thomas recognized from town. One of them was wearing a deputy's badge. That was bad. That meant this had the appearance of law behind it. Sections Ezra leaned forward in his saddle. You had a week, Whitaker. Time's up. Sections. Thomas said nothing. Sections, the deputy, spoke up. Mr. Whitaker, we've had complaints from the community about an Indian woman living on your property. There's concern about safety, about propriety. We're here to escort her to the reservation for her own protection. She's not going, Thomas said. That's not your decision to make, the deputy said. She's Indian. She belongs on the reservation. She belongs here, Ezra laughed. Listen to him. She belongs here. You think she's yours, Whitaker? You think you own her? I think she's a person, Thomas said. I think she can choose where she wants to be. Indians don't get to choose, Ezra said. That's the law. Thomas felt her move beside him. She stepped forward to the edge of the porch. Every eye went to her. She stood there, straight-backed, her chin up, her hands loose at her sides. She looked at Ezra, then at the deputy, then at each of the other men in turn. She was measuring them, judging them, finding them, wanting. Sections. Then she spoke. These sections. Her voice was clear, strong, and it cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. I am not property, she said in perfect English. I am not yours to move. So Thomas felt the world stop. 3 months of silence. And now this. She continued, her eyes on Ezra. I came here dying. This man saved my life. He asked nothing of me. He gave me shelter, food, safety. He treated me like a human being when your people would have left me to die in the creek. She paused. I choose to stay. No, that is my right. That is my choice. Trower. Ezra's face went red. You don't have rights, squaw. You're Pertwarfor. I am Lakota, she said, and her voice was ice. My name is Ayana. I am the daughter of a chief. I am a healer. I am worth more than you will ever understand, and I am staying. Riva. Thomas couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and her voice was filling his ears, his chest, his whole body. She'd been listening. All this time she'd been listening to him talk, absorbing every word, understanding everything. She'd chosen silence, and now she'd chosen to speak. Pargor. Ezra's hand went to his gun. That's it. We're taking her. Anyone who tries to stop us is interfering with the law. Sections. Thomas raised the rifle. It was pointed at Ezra's chest. His hands were steady. You're not taking her. Sections. The deputy's hand went to his own gun. The other men shifted in their saddles. The math was simple. 6 guns against 1. Thomas would get 1 shot, maybe 2. Then he'd die, and they'd take her anyway. But he didn't lower the rifle. Ayana turned to him. She put her hand on the barrel of the rifle and pushed it down gently. He looked at her. She shook her head. Not this way. Sections. Then she turned back to the men. You want to take me, she said. Then you will have to kill him first, because he will not let you. And if you kill him, I will make sure every person in this territory knows that 6 armed men murdered an unarmed rancher to kidnap a woman who asked only to be left in peace. I will tell that story in every town, every fort, every trading post between here and the Canadian border. Your names will be known. Your shame will be known. Charter. She stepped closer to the edge of the porch. Or you can leave. You can ride back to your town and tell them the Indian woman is staying and there is nothing you can do about it. You can choose to be remembered as cowards instead of murderers. It is your choice. Fatur. Silence. Long, heavy, crackling with tension. Ezra's face was purple now. His jaw clenched so hard Thomas could see the muscles jumping. His hand was still on his gun. 1 move. That's all it would take. Patrastra, the deputy, spoke first. Ezra, this ain't worth it. Let's go. Perpert, the hell it ain't, Ezra snarled. I ain't letting some Pirabathorn. I said, let's go. The deputy's voice was hard now. You want to explain to the territorial marshal why you shot a man over a woman who don't want to leave? You want that kind of attention, because I sure as hell don't. Sections Ezra stared at Thomas, then at Ayanna. His hand tightened on the gun, then slowly, reluctantly, let go. This ain't over, Whitaker. Pirapafuro. Yes, Ayanna said. It is. But Ezra spat in the dirt, yanked his horse around, and rode away. His sons followed. The other men looked at each other, then at the deputy, then followed as well. The deputy was the last to leave. He touched the brim of his hat to Thomas, not friendly, but acknowledging. Then he was gone. Sections Thomas and Ayanna stood on the porch, watching the dust settle. Clay stopped growling. The world was quiet again. Thomas lowered the rifle. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining out of him all at once. Pratior, he turned to her. She was looking at him, her face unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. What could he say? Thank you seemed too small. I'm sorry seemed wrong. Everything seemed wrong. Pavra, she spoke first. You would have died for me. Pavras, it wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. Yes. Bifar, why? Bifars, he looked at her, really looked at her. At the strength in her face, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet dignity that no amount of cruelty could break. He thought about the garden she'd built from nothing, the food she'd cooked that had brought warmth back into his cold house, the flowers in the tin cup, the sound of her singing in the darkness, the way Clay followed her like she was the sun and he was the earth. Pulled by gravity he couldn't resist. Because you brought my home back to life, he said. Because I was dead and you made me want to live again. Because you're the best thing that's happened to me in 3 years, and I'll be damned if I let them take you. Sections. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked away, blinking hard. When she looked back, the tears were gone, but something else had taken their place. Something soft, something open. For my husband died, she said quietly. Killed by men who looked like those men. I ran for weeks. I was dying when I found your creek. I thought I would die there. I wanted to die there. She paused. But then you came. You carried me out of the water. You fought the fever with me. You gave me space to heal. You gave me work to do. You gave me a reason to keep breathing. Parabarfar. She stepped closer. I stayed silent because I was afraid. Afraid that if I spoke, you would send me away. Afraid that if you knew I understood your language, you would see me as a threat. Afraid that if I let myself hope, it would be taken away again. She reached up and touched his face, the same light touch from before, but this time she didn't pull away. But you never asked me to leave. You never treated me as less. You never took what I did not offer. You are a good man, Thomas Whitaker. The best man I have ever known. Sections. Thomas felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 3 years. He raised his hand and covered hers where it rested against his face. Her skin was warm, calloused from work, real and solid and alive. Stay, he said. Please, stay. Yes, she said. I will stay. He pulled her into his arms and she came willingly, her body fitting against his like it had always belonged there. He held her carefully, afraid she might break, afraid this might be a dream. But she was solid and warm and real. She wrapped her arms around him and held on just as tightly. Bar. They stood there on the porch as the sun moved across the sky, 2 people who had been alone too long, finally finding home in each other. Patmo. That night they sat by the fire. He told her about his wife, his daughter, the grief that had turned him into a ghost. And she told him about her husband, her village, the violence that had scattered her people and sent her running into the wilderness. They spoke quietly, trading sorrows, finding that shared grief was lighter than grief carried alone. Parabra. When the fire burned low, she stood and held out her hand. He took it. She led him to the bed he'd given her 3 months ago, the bed he hadn't slept in since. She lay down and pulled him down beside her. He wrapped his arms around her, and she rested her head on his chest. They lay there in the darkness, breathing together, two broken people making something whole. Autumn came. The garden yielded its harvest, and Ayana filled the cabin with stores for winter. She taught him the names of plants in her language, and he taught her the names of tools in his. They worked side by side, and their movements synchronized like a dance they'd been practicing for years. Clay grew fat and lazy, sleeping by the fire, content in a way he'd never been before. Thomas took Ayana into town once. She rode beside him on the wagon seat, her head high, her hand resting on his arm. People stared, some whispered, most looked away. Ezra Cobb was standing outside the saloon. He watched them pass with hate in his eyes, but he didn't move, didn't speak. The deputy had made it clear. The matter was closed. Sections Thomas bought supplies and loaded the wagon. The storekeeper was polite, but cold. The banker nodded but didn't smile. It didn't matter. Thomas had stopped caring what the town thought of him a long time ago. He had everything he needed sitting beside him on the wagon seat. Sections on the way home, Ayana started singing, in the same haunting melody from that first night, but now he understood what it meant. It was a song about finding home after a long journey, about safety after fear, about love after loss. But he reached over and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his and kept singing. Parfar. Winter came hard and early. The first snow fell in October, heavy and thick. Thomas and Ayana sat by the fire, watching the white world outside the window. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of stew and bread and wood smoke. Clay snored by the hearth. The shelves were full. The wood was stacked. They were ready. Pierre Braperfor's Ayana leaned against Thomas, her head on his shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked. Pierre Braperos, he thought about it. Happiness wasn't something he'd thought about in years. It seemed like a luxury, something for other people. But now, sitting here with her warmth against his side, and the snow falling outside, and the fire crackling, and the dog snoring, and the cabin full of life again, yes, he was happy. Parfar, yes, he said. I'm happy. Parfar, she smiled. Good. Me too. Bar. They sat there as the snow piled up outside, two people who had been lost and were now found, building a life together one quiet day at a time. Biapra spring came eventually, the way it always does. The snow melted, and the creek ran high, and the wild flowers bloomed on the hill, where Thomas's wife and daughter were buried. Ayana walked up there one morning and came back with flowers. She put them in a tin cup on the table, the same way she'd done that first time. Thomas looked at them and felt the last piece of ice in his chest finally melt. The garden was planted again, bigger this time. The Ayana sang while she worked, and Thomas found himself humming along, learning the melodies by heart. Clay chased rabbits he'd never catch. The sun rose and set. The seasons turned. Life went on, better than before, full of small joys and shared silences, and the quiet knowledge that they had found something rare and precious and worth fighting for. Par Farf. They had found each other, and that was enough. Par, thank you for listening to this story. Sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we hold back until the moment they're truly needed. Sometimes silence is its own kind of trust, and the choice to finally speak is the greatest gift we can give. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had someone in your life who saw the real you when the rest of the world looked away? I'll see you in the next one.